A quiet welcome to PlotFall. Tonight, we journey together, not through bustling streets or shining lights, but along a path once walked by traders, travelers, and dreamers, the ancient Silk Road. A place where the landscape stretched endlessly, the air was dry and thin, and every traveler faced dangers they couldn't always predict. Before we begin, if you find values in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the light, or maybe turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The world you are about to visit no longer exists. It lives in quiet ruins, in dusty scrolls, in the faded threads of cloth and memory. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a winding web that stretched across mountains, deserts, and empires, from the glittering palaces of China to the crowded markets of the Mediterranean. It was not just a passage of trade, but a passage of souls, of monks, merchants, explorers, and dreamers. It connected faraway kingdoms long before maps could chart them. Along it moved not only silk and spices, but languages, ideas, plagues, and gods. It was beautiful. It was brutal. And for most, it was barely survivable. As we walk through the echoes of its dust-covered trails, we won't do so in haste. There will be no battles shouted, no drums of war. Only the soft crunch of caravan footsteps. Only the hum of wind over an empty pass. Only the fragile pulse of human endurance. This is not just a history of trade, but a quiet remembering of what it truly meant to try to survive the Silk Road. Close your eyes. Let the stars of the desert sky guide you. Our journey begins. To those who heard of it from afar, the Silk Road was not merely a path, it was a promise. A promise of fortune, of spices never tasted, fabrics never touched, stories never told. To the merchant in Antioch or Xi'an, it was the thread that might change a family's destiny. To the wandering monk, it was the road to sacred texts and sacred lands. And to kings, it was power, a bridge between worlds, and the means to bind their realms with goods and glory. But none of them saw it fully. Each only glimpsed their part of it, their dreams stitched into the larger fabric. For some, it was the glint of Chinese silk under morning sun. For others, it was the scent of saffron wafting from Persian caravans. For a pilgrim, it was the ache of the feet and the hope of salvation just beyond the horizon. Legends surrounded the road like mirages. Cities made of gold, oasis kingdoms with eternal gardens, libraries beneath the sands. It enchanted even those who would never walk a step of it, because to speak of the Silk Road was to speak of something far larger than any single life. It was a vein of the world, pulsing with risk and wonder. Yet enchantment has a price. For every tale of riches gained, there were dozens buried in silence. Traders who vanished in sandstorms, pilgrims who starved in forgotten passes, kings whose armies withered before they could conquer a mile more. Still they came. All of them. Drawn by that quiet, enduring spell. What waits beyond the next mountain? And so they walked, not for days or weeks, but for months, even years. What lay ahead was not a simple journey, but a world stitched together by time and footstep. The Silk Road stretched like a great artery through the body of the ancient world, winding across the Himalayas, curling past the Caspian Sea, and fading into the sands beyond Damascus. It was not a single road, but many. Splintering like the roots of an old tree, it ran through cities and deserts, mountains and valleys, touching places whose names have long since disappeared into dust. From Chang'an in the east to Constantinople in the west, its fingers reached toward India, Arabia, Africa, and beyond. To those who lived far from it, it felt almost mythic. They imagined it paved in silk and gold, lined with exotic beasts and mysterious traders whispering in languages no one else understood. Maps of it were vague, filled with mountains drawn like teeth and dragons guarding corners. The unknown gave it shape, and in that uncertainty, the legend grew. But the truth was far more complex. What connected these distant lands was not a grand highway, but narrow paths carved by need. Sometimes it was nothing more than footprints pressed into sand. Sometimes it was the memory of a direction passed from one rider to the next. And sometimes the road disappeared altogether, swallowed by shifting dunes or swallowed by war. Still, it was real. Not in the way myths are real, but in the way hardship is real. In the ache of the legs, in the parched mouth, in the hope carried in a worn pouch of saffron or a bolt of silk wrapped tightly in cloth. And as we move forward now, it is not just the scale of the journey we must feel, but the silence that lay between each step. For along this road, vastness was not measured in miles, but in how far the human spirit could stretch before it broke. And in that silence between footsteps, where the wind spoke louder than words and the stars blinked cold above empty plains, it became clear: the Silk Road was never truly paved in luxury. Yes, silks moved. Gold changed hands. Spices, glassware, ivory, and jewels glittered in the lamplight of caravanserais. But those were the rewards of a few. For most, the Silk Road was not a road of riches. It was a road of survival, a test of endurance wrapped in dust and hunger. Luxury was what waited at the very edges, in the courts of sultans or the counting houses of empires. But to reach them, one had to pass through trials of sandstorms, suspicion, exhaustion, and solitude. The road tested more than your strength. It tested your patience, your trust, your sense of direction, even your will to go on. Caravans were not grand processions. They were weary columns of men and animals straining under heat and weight. Nights were not restful. They were filled with the anxious rustle of goods, the quiet sob of someone falling ill, the ever-present fear that tomorrow might never arrive. And so, as we begin our walk deeper into this ancient path, let us leave behind the illusion of silk-draped ease. Let us listen instead to the footsteps of those who walked before us, those who carried with them not just goods, but burdens. Because the true story of the Silk Road is not about what was traded, but what was risked. The road does not begin with a grand gate or trumpet call. It begins quietly, often before dawn, when the stars are still bright and the world has not yet stirred. The first steps are taken in half-light, as breath curls in the cold and hooves press into frost-hardened soil. There is no celebration, only motion. For those setting out from the eastern cities of Chang'an or Luoyang, or the oases of Central Asia, the road unfolded slowly, a horizon that never seemed to draw closer. What lay ahead was not a stretch of civilization, but a vast emptiness divided by hardship. One of the first lessons every traveler learned was that distance on the Silk Road was not measured in miles, but in effort. The mountains rose like ancient gods, their passes narrow and cruel. The Pamir, the Hindu Kush, the Tian Shan, names that sounded distant and exotic in the comfort of a city, became something else entirely underfoot. The slopes stole breath. The cold bit through every layer of cloth. Avalanches were swift and merciless. And then there were the deserts, endless seas of silence. The Taklamakan, whose name means "you go in and you don't come out." The Gobi, where the wind could peel flesh and the sky offered no shelter. Sand swallowed paths. The sun hollowed men. Water was a treasure. Shade, a miracle. A single lost turn could stretch a day's journey into oblivion. And always, always, there was the weight of goods, of responsibility, of not knowing what would come next. Yet they went on, because there was no other choice. Whether driven by duty, by hunger, by trade, or by faith, each step forward was a quiet rebellion against the land itself. And the land was not kind. In that motion, a strange rhythm formed. Wake before light. Load the animals. Watch the horizon. Hope for a landmark. Camp when the sun collapses. Repeat. The Silk Road did not punish in rage. It punished in repetition. And only those who could endure the silence, the slowness, the aching sameness of terrain after terrain, would survive to see its other end. There is something quiet about suffering when it comes slowly. The Silk Road did not wound with drama. It wore you down, a little more each day. Each morning began not with song or speech, but with groaning leather and stiff limbs. Blankets of woven wool, damp with dew, were folded with tired fingers. Camels were stirred awake with low grumbles. The fires from the night before, if there had been fuel enough to build them, were now just ashes kissed by frost. Marches began early, always early, because daylight was precious. The earlier you moved, the less the sun would punish you. The feet of travelers were wrapped in cloth and hope, but still they blistered. Sand crept into every seam. Rocks pressed through soles. Dust filled lungs and settled into the creases of the skin, becoming a second layer over the body, one that never truly washed away. Each step forward became a small act of faith, that the next camp would have water, that no one would fall behind, that the animals would endure one more hour. Nights brought no true rest. The cold came suddenly once the sun dropped behind the dunes or mountains, turning sweat into a biting chill. Cloaks were pulled tighter. Fires, if lit, were ringed closely. Stories were sometimes whispered, not for joy, but to keep the silence at bay. Food, if it had not spoiled, was simple and sparse. Often dried meat. A bit of rice, if you were lucky. Flatbread, brittle from age. And sleep? Sleep was light. One ear always open to the grunt of a restless camel, or the distant howl of a desert wind, or worse, the sound of footsteps that did not belong. The days were hot, dry, and endless. The nights were cold, quiet, and full of ache. There was no comfort, only movement. And even when you sat down, the road remained within you, in the soreness of your shoulders, the cracking of your lips, the weight of distance still ahead. To live a single week on the Silk Road was to forget softness. To live a month was to forget what it felt like to feel clean. And yet, they did it. All of them. Because sometimes, reaching the next town, the next outpost, the next sliver of water and light, was enough. And because for many, turning back was not an option. Even among others, the Silk Road was a lonely place. You might walk beside 20 men. You might sleep near 100. And still, a silence would follow you, not outside, but within. A silence that grew not from solitude, but from the slow unraveling of familiarity. For most travelers, the people around them were strangers. Hired guards, other merchants, pilgrims from far-off provinces. They spoke different tongues. They believed in different gods. They mourned in different ways. And though they shared the same path, each carried a separate burden, one that could not be lightened by conversation. Words were rare. Energy was precious. Breath was saved for walking. When speech did come, it was practical. Tie the strap tighter. The mule has gone lame. We reach the river by nightfall. Then silence again. And in that quiet, thoughts echoed. Home began to feel like something from a dream. Faces blurred. Names faded. The smell of your own house. The laughter of a child. The voice of a mother. All replaced by the endless sound of footsteps, wind, and the soft groan of wooden wheels. Even the animals seemed lost in thought. Camels, eyes half-lidded, plodded forward with the weariness of creatures who had known this road far longer than you had. They did not comfort. They simply endured. Sometimes, in the vastness of a sand dune or the stillness of a mountain pass, you would look around and realize there was no sign of the world you had once known. No temple bells. No city walls. Just you and the road. And in that moment, it was easy to wonder if you were the last person left in the world. Letters were rare and often never arrived. Memories were fragile. The only constant was forward. And so, travelers learned to keep their thoughts close. To speak with their eyes. To watch the stars at night and find something in them, not guidance, but companionship. a silent reassurance that though they were far from everything, they were not entirely alone. Because even on the loneliest road, the sky remained. And under its vast, quiet dome, 1,000 had walked before you, and 1,000 more would come. What made the Silk Road so unforgiving was not just the harshness of its climates, but their contrast. A traveler might begin in the warm lowlands of eastern China, surrounded by green hills and soft winds, only to find themselves days later trudging across the blistering Taklamakan Desert, where even the wind seemed to burn. And beyond that, snow-capped peaks, where the sun deceived and the cold bit harder than any blade. The journey was a passage not just through space, but through seasons, and sometimes those seasons changed in a single day. In Central Asia, spring could turn to winter by afternoon. One moment, you might be loosening your robe under the weight of the heat. The next, you'd be tightening it against a sky that had turned suddenly gray and cruel, snow falling like silence made visible. And these shifts were not gentle. The Silk Road was not a place of moderation. The sun did not warm, it scorched. The cold did not chill, it cut. The rains, when they came, did not soothe, they flooded. And when the wind rose, it could strip skin, topple tents, and erase the road entirely, replacing it with nothing but dunes or blinding sheets of white. The mountains brought their own dangers. The passes, high, narrow, jagged, were home to sudden storms and creeping ice. Slopes collapsed. Rocks fell without warning. The air grew thin, making breath shallow and sleep restless. And if a storm caught you too far from shelter, there was little to do but wait, and hope your fire, your tent, your companions would hold. In the steppes, the weather was deceptive. The sky looked vast and calm, but storms could rise like armies, sweeping over the land with lightning and dust, shaking the earth with thunder that echoed across the plains. Horses panicked. Camels stumbled. Men lost their way in storms that looked, from afar, like nothing at all. And when the wind died down, you were left with silence again. Not peace, just stillness, and the knowledge that you were even farther from the world you had known. The greatest danger was not just any one kind of weather, but the change itself, the uncertainty, the fact that your body, your clothing, your supplies might be suited for today, but not for tomorrow. And the Silk Road did not wait for the unprepared. It demanded that you adapt or disappear. And many did disappear. Some frozen, some lost, some buried by storms no one saw coming. Still, they went forward, because ahead there was trade to be made, or family to return to, or a story worth the risk. And because sometimes it is not courage that keeps you going, but simply that you have already come too far to turn back. Hunger on the Silk Road was never sudden. It crept in, not with cries or cravings, but with a dull quietness, a slowing of steps, a softening of the voice, a traveler staring too long at a single grain of rice in their bowl. For those who walked the trade routes, food was not a meal. It was a calculation, an ever-dwindling reserve of energy, measured not in satisfaction, but in survival. The journey stretched for months, and though the caravans were laden with goods, most of what they carried was not edible. There were bolts of silk, pots of porcelain, bundles of herbs, but food took up space. Food spoiled. Food had to be rationed with care. Dried meat was the most precious, and the most heavily guarded. It lasted long but grew tough as leather. Rice, lentils, flatbread, these were common early on, cooked in thin stews that barely clung to flavor. But over time, supplies dwindled. Meals shrank. The spices that made even the simplest dish bearable were saved for the sick, or simply ran out. And then what remained was plain, often bitter. Some days, travelers chewed dried roots or foraged for wild plants whose names they did not know. Some tried catching lizards, birds, even insects, anything with a scrap of meat. Many fell ill from eating the wrong thing. But in the face of emptiness, risk tasted better than nothing. The hunger changed the body slowly. Muscles faded, eyes hollowed. The strong grew quiet. Even camels, if not carefully fed, began to stumble under loads they once bore with ease. Malnutrition became a companion, one that weakened limbs and clouded thought. And once it settled in, recovery was slow, if it came at all. Children fared worst. Their energy vanished quickly, and they often needed more than there was to give. Parents gave up their shares. Elders offered theirs too. But even sacrifice could not fill a pot with food that simply wasn't there. And hunger was not just physical. It lived in the mind. The thought of roasted meat, of hot soup, of a full table at home, it lingered. At night, as the cold wrapped around the bones and the stars watched in silence, travelers dreamed not of riches, but of bread, soft, warm bread, torn and shared. Sometimes, when a town appeared in the distance, a wave of hope swept through the caravan. Hope that a market might still be open, that a farmer might share some roots or milk, that there would be something, anything, to break the hunger. But other times they found only emptiness, or prices so high that even silk could not buy a meal. And so they walked on, not because they were strong, but because they were hungry. And sometimes, hunger is enough to keep your feet moving long after everything else has given out. But even hunger, with its slow ache and hollow belly, was only one of the many weights carried along the Silk Road. Because when the body is underfed, it loses more than strength. It loses its ability to fight, to hold warmth, to shield itself against heat. And on this road, where the world swung violently between fire and frost, that weakness could be fatal. Cold and heat did not visit the Silk Road gently. They arrived in extremes. In the mountains, cold seeped in not like a storm, but like a slow possession. It started in the fingertips, a tingling, a numbness, and then a pain so sharp it became quiet. Frostbite worked silently. It killed sensation before it killed flesh. To walk with frozen toes was to feel nothing until the skin blackened, and the damage could no longer be undone. Frost claimed ears, noses, fingers. It stole them without fanfare. Just a change in color, then a change in shape, then a silence where once there had been pain. And in the deserts, there was no frost, only the other extreme. The heat was a different kind of cruelty. It rose from the ground. It beat from above. It surrounded you like a weightless fire. Heat exhaustion did not always arrive with a fever. Sometimes, it came with forgetfulness, dizziness, the sudden urge to sit in the middle of a trail and never rise again. Sweat stopped, and that was the danger. Because the body, trying to conserve what little it had, ceased to cool itself. Skin flushed, then dried. Tongue thickened. Thoughts tangled. And those around you began to speak your name, not out of conversation, but to keep you present. But it was thirst, simple, relentless thirst, that broke the spirit most of all. Water was always scarce. Wells were not guaranteed. Streams could be dry for miles. When a traveler held a half-empty water skin, they held it like a sacred object. Every drop was a choice. Drink now, or save it for when the need would be greater. Dehydration was quiet. It hollowed the eyes. It made speech difficult. It made walking, the one task no one could avoid, feel like lifting stones with each footstep. The lips cracked until they bled. Urine darkened to almost nothing. And when the mind began to slip, the danger became real. Some collapsed beside their camels, unable to move. Others, delirious, wandered from the path in search of phantom rivers. A few never made it to the next camp, their bones later found by shepherds or fellow traders, half buried by wind and time. And still, the road stretched on. Because on the Silk Road, the body was not your ally. It was your burden. And survival was not a matter of strength, but of endurance. If hunger and weather tested the body, disease tested everything else. Your resilience, your luck, your closeness to others, even your will to touch, to breathe, to stay near the ones you loved. The Silk Road, for all its promise, did not carry only goods. It carried death. Invisible, quiet, and devastating. Caravans were more than just strings of traders. They were moving villages, people and animals packed closely together for weeks at a time. They shared food, fires, water, and unknowingly, something else. Something too small to see. Something that moved faster than any horse and spread farther than any rumor. Disease. The most infamous of them all, the Black Death, traveled these very paths. From the ports of the East to the heartlands of Europe, it rode on fleas hidden in the fur of rats that nested in merchant wagons. It crept into cities on the backs of camels, passed hand to hand in coin and cloth, and crossed borders no army ever could. It did not care for status. Kings and beggars alike fell to it. It arrived without warning. First a fever, then swelling, then silence. Entire caravans were lost to it. Towns along the trade route, once bustling with life and trade, became ghost villages. Empty stalls, locked doors, no smoke in the chimneys, just the wind and the memory of voices. But the Black Death was not alone. Other illnesses followed. Typhoid, dysentery, malaria, influenza, 1,000 unnamed fevers that struck suddenly and cruelly, made worse by exhaustion, poor food, tainted water, and close proximity. One sick traveler could doom dozens. And there were no hospitals here. No antiseptics. No antibiotics. Just crude herbs, whispered prayers, and the hope that rest might be enough. Often it wasn't. The sick were carried on wagons, wrapped in blankets damp with sweat. Some were left behind, not out of cruelty, but necessity. A caravan could not wait for the dying. If it did, everyone risked joining them. And so the Silk Road, as it carried perfumes and poems, also became a vein through which disease pulsed, not just across regions, but across civilizations. The irony was sharp. The very path that brought the world closer also brought it to its knees. Even those who escaped the plagues were not free from illness. On the Silk Road, you didn't need a great sickness to fall. Sometimes, it was the smallest wound that undid you. A blister torn open from days of walking. A camel's bite. A careless slip against a jagged rock. These were not unusual, but the road made them dangerous. There were no sterile bandages, no clean needles, no understanding of the invisible world that lived in dirt, in water, on the hands of the well-meaning. A wound left open in the desert could become a slow death sentence. The heat made it fester. The flies followed it. The smell told others what you already knew. Infection had begun. There was no penicillin, no trained doctor, only poultices of crushed herbs and cloth boiled over fire if fuel could be spared. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they didn't. And when infection spread, when the skin blackened, the fever rose, and the body began to tremble, all you could do was lie still and hope your name might be remembered. Water, too, was a treacherous companion. When you found it, it felt like salvation. But not all water gave life. In low valleys and forgotten wells, water stagnated. It looked clear, but carried sickness. A sip could bring days of agony, stomach cramps, vomiting, endless thirst made worse by the very water that caused it. Cholera, dysentery, unknown fevers with no names and no cures. Some travelers tried boiling their water, but fuel was limited. Others added herbs or wine, hoping to mask whatever lurked within. Sometimes it worked, it did not. And when illness struck, there was little choice. The caravan moved on. The sick were carried, if possible. But if they could not rise, if they became too weak to sit, too fevered to drink, a decision had to be made. The sands of the Silk Road are not only filled with stones and footprints. They hold bones to, quite, unmarked, left beneath piles of stones or shallow graves, far from home. The road was long. The terrain was brutal, but what claimed the most lives were the things too small to see, the ones carried in wounds, in water, and in breath. And all the silk and spice in the world could not pay for a cure that did not exist. When illness came, and it always came, there was no doctor waiting in a clean room with white robes and polished tools. Instead, there were hands. Calloused, experienced hands. Sometimes trembling with age, sometimes steady with practice. Healers, herbalists, midwives, monks, each carrying knowledge passed down through word, not written word, but memory. These were the caretakers of the sick on the Silk Road. They worked with what they had: roots, dried flowers, powdered stones, oils pressed from seeds, bark scraped into boiling water. In some places, illness was treated with fire. In others, with cold. Incense might be burned to drive away bad spirits. A fever might be bled, the body drained with a thin knife to let the sickness out. A poultice might be tied to a wound with cloth already used by others. There were charms sewn into sleeves, prayers whispered over the lips of the dying, rituals made in quiet desperation beneath the stars. And sometimes people got better, whether by chance, by strength, or by the careful rhythm of care. Some rose from their mats, blinking into the light of a new morning. But more often, they did not. Because the truth is that the medicine of the Silk Road, though full of wisdom, was built in a world that had not yet seen the invisible. Germs, bacteria, viruses, these ideas had no names. Disease was thought to come from imbalance, from the stars, from demons, from cold winds or spoiled thoughts. And so treatment was a dance in the dark. A healer might do all they could, mixing honey and ash, or placing heated stones on the belly. But if the sickness was deep, if the lungs filled, if the fever burned too long, no mixture could stop it. There was no safety in coin, no guarantee in status. A rich merchant could die just as quickly as a servant. Illness humbled everyone. It was the one companion that made no deals. And those who survived remembered, not the pain, but the kindness. A hand wiping sweat from a forehead. A voice humming a soft chant through the night. A stranger sharing water. These became the medicines that truly mattered. Because on a road where death was always near, sometimes the most powerful healing came not from herbs or prayers, but from gentleness. Not all dangers on the Silk Road came from nature. Some walked on 2 feet, with blades in their hands and silence in their approach. There were places along the route where travelers grew quieter, where laughter disappeared from camps, where eyes scanned the distant hills, not for landmarks, but for movement. These were the lawless frontiers, regions where the reach of kings and khans faded, and only one rule remained: whoever strikes first survives. Some of these places were known. Their names passed in hushed warnings from caravan to caravan. Narrow passes in the mountains of Bactria, the desert edges near Dunhuang, the wild steppes beyond Samarkand. These were not just empty stretches, they were hunting grounds. Bandits knew the route well. They knew the choke points, the rivers that had to be crossed, the cliffs that funneled travelers into tight paths with nowhere to run. And they waited. Sometimes they came in small groups, a few desperate men on foot, looking for food or coin. But other times, they came in silence and numbers. Mounted raiders, swift and practiced. They didn't just steal, they planned. They watched a caravan for days, counted its guards, studied its rhythm, and then, under moonlight or sandstorm, they struck. The sounds of such moments were not loud. A shout, the thud of hooves, the twang of a bowstring, the cry of a startled animal. Then confusion, and then, often, nothing. The next morning, there might be fewer wagons. A few riders missing, goods gone, or worse, a trail of blood in the dust, quickly covered by wind. The raiders were not always strangers. In some places, entire towns survived by trading with them in secret. A share of silk here, a pouch of jade there. a bribe paid to be left alone, until it wasn't enough. Even the most careful caravans could fall prey. Guards could be bought. Guides could betray. And the sheer vastness of the land meant that help, if it existed at all, was always too far away. There were no borders out here. No patrols. No laws that held past the last city gate. Only the hope that you wouldn't be the slowest. That your cargo wasn't the most tempting. That tonight, the firelight wouldn't draw the wrong kind of eyes from the hills. And so, travelers wrapped their treasures in cloth and silence. They sharpened knives, not just for cooking. They kept coins hidden in their boots and weapons close to their sleeping mats. Because on the Silk Road, a man might walk 1,000 miles, only to lose everything in a single hour. Where gold traveled, so did danger. And so, protection became its quiet companion. The Silk Road was not a trail walked lightly. It was a corridor of ambition, and where there is ambition, there are those who wish to take what others carry. To defend against that, caravans did not move alone. They moved under watchful eyes, beneath hands that carried blades, and beside riders who had seen things too brutal to speak of. These were the caravan guards. Mercenaries, mostly. Some were former soldiers who had served in forgotten wars. Others were local fighters. Men who knew the deserts, the mountain passes, the tricks of raiders who once might have been their neighbors. They weren't always paid well. Sometimes they were paid in goods. Sometimes in promises. But they stayed. Because danger was a trade too, and they knew it well. They bore scars from battles long past. Not the kind that came from glory, but from survival. A gash across the ribs, a hand that no longer closed properly, an old limp hidden beneath thick boots. And yet they marched. Their weapons were practical. Bows wrapped in leather to keep the string dry. Swords dulled and resharpened so many times they seemed thinner than they should be. Short spears for tight spaces, curved daggers for close defense. Some carried slings. Others carried nothing at all, relying on fists and instinct. They trained little. There was rarely time. But when the wind grew too quiet and the animals grew restless, they moved quickly, formed a circle, stepped into the dark, eyes narrowed, hands on hilts, listening, because trouble didn't announce itself on the Silk Road. It crept in, a shape behind a dune, a rider too far off the path, a reflection of sunlight that shouldn't be there. And when it came, there was no time for commands or ranks, just chaos. The guard's job was never to win. It was to hold, to buy enough time for the caravan to flee, to protect the merchant with the strongest bargaining power, to shield the youngest camel boy with shaking hands. Sometimes, their presence alone was enough. A well-armed caravan sent a signal, not worth it. Raiders watched and waited for something easier. The guards, then, were not just protectors, they were deterrents. Silent warnings standing between greed and its goal. But when that wasn't enough, the struggle began. Fights were rarely fair. Raiders struck in darkness, from above, with numbers. The guards fought knowing they might not return to their bedrolls. They bled beside the very goods they were hired to protect. Bolts of silk soaked in red, spice sacks trampled underfoot. Sometimes they prevailed. More often, they held the line just long enough for others to escape. And when it was over, when the dust settled and the attackers vanished, those who remained did not cheer. They packed quickly, gathered what they could, buried the dead if time allowed, then moved on, because the road was still waiting. In that way, caravan guards were not heroes. They were something quieter, enduring, constant. They were the thin edge between movement and stillness, between trade and ruin. And though history forgets most of their names, their presence stitched every successful journey together. Without them, there would be no Silk Road. Only silence. Not every caravan had guards. Not every traveler could afford protection. Some were pilgrims walking for faith. Some were lone traders, hopeful but poor. Some were children, born into the road without ever choosing it. And when danger came, there was nowhere to run. Being caught defenseless on the Silk Road did not always mean immediate violence. Often, it began with a shadow, a strange stillness. Riders on the horizon who did not wave, who did not speak. Eyes watching from the rocks. A rustle in the distance that never resolved. Then came the moment. A rush of dust. A scream. And everything changed. For those without weapons, there was no strategy, no counterstrike, no formation to take. Just instinct. Some froze. Others ran. Some tried to bargain, offering coins, fabrics, even camels, hoping that the raiders wanted goods more than blood. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Goods were taken. Packs slashed open with blades. Water skins emptied onto the ground. Food spilled into the dust. Rings pulled from fingers. Shoes taken. And sometimes, people. Young men were pressed into service. Women disappeared. Children cried until their voices broke. The lucky ones were stripped and left behind. The unlucky never reached the next outpost. There were no records kept. No justice sought. No armies dispatched. In the vast, lawless wilds of the Silk Road, what happened in one corner of the desert stayed with the wind. And what lingered most for those who survived was not always the pain, but the helplessness. The realization that in that moment, with no sword, no coin, no ally, your life belonged entirely to the will of another. That you had no defense but mercy. And mercy was not something the road often gave. Those who survived such encounters wore the silence of it for the rest of their lives. They walked differently, slept lightly, trusted little. Their eyes flicked toward every unfamiliar movement, not out of fear but memory. And yet, they continued, because for many there was no choice. The Silk Road was not a tale of freedom. It was a necessity to survive, to reach, to return. And even if defenseless, even if broken, they still walked. And in the dust behind them, all that remained was a story carried quietly by the road and never spoken aloud again. To walk the Silk Road was not only to cross land, but to cross lives. Worlds folded into one another here, vast empires and forgotten villages, each with their own languages, beliefs, gods, laws, and silences. In the West, a traveler might begin among Persian gardens, shaded by cypress trees, where the air carried the scent of rosewater and the quiet murmur of Farsi poetry. In Persia, hospitality was sacred, and the guest was treated with warmth and pride. But manners mattered. To speak too loudly, to enter a room with shoes unremoved, to eat without offering thanks, these could offend deeply, even without intention. Further east, the road dipped into Central Asia, the wild steppes of Turkic tribes and nomadic clans. Here, customs flowed with the wind. Tents rose and vanished overnight. Meat roasted over fire, and milk was served fermented. Strangers were watched carefully. Friendship was earned slowly. Here, the eye contact that meant respect in one place could mean threat in another. A left hand extended in greeting could close a door forever. In India, where travelers passed through cities rich with temples and crowded with colors, faith shaped everything. A trader might hear the chants of monks at dawn, smell incense drifting through the alleys, and witness rituals performed under banyan trees. Here, cows were not to be harmed. Sacred rivers were not to be polluted. Feet pointed at elders, even by accident, could mark one as deeply disrespectful. And yet, kindness often prevailed. Even a dusty traveler might be given water, food, a moment of shade, and a smile. And in China, where the eastern path met the walls of great cities like Chang'an or Dunhuang, formality ruled. A bow meant everything: its angle, its timing, its humility. The emperor was not spoken of casually. The state was not questioned. Confucian ideals wove through conversation like thread through silk. Harmony, order, deference, these were not mere values, but expectations. A traveler who laughed too loudly, dressed too boldly, or disrespected hierarchy might find doors quietly closed to them. And so, the Silk Road was not just a crossing of terrain, it was a crossing of invisible rules. A quiet dance of observation and adaptation. To survive, one had to listen more than speak, to watch more than assume, to ask gently, to offer gifts freely, to let go of the certainty that your way was the only way. Because on the Silk Road, survival was not only about enduring the land, but about navigating the delicate, beautiful, and dangerous spaces between people. It was not always the sword or the storm that made the Silk Road perilous. Sometimes, it was a word, spoken too quickly, mispronounced, or said in the wrong place to the wrong person. The road wound through dozens of languages: Persian, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Arabic, Uyghur, Greek. Some tongues were lyrical, others clipped and sharp. Some used gestures, others relied on tone. Traders carried phrasebooks scratched onto thin parchment. Others hired interpreters, men who spoke 5 or 6 tongues, weaving between languages like smoke between stones. But even with help, there were gaps. A misunderstood price could cost a fortune. A wrongly translated proverb could be taken as insult. A blessing in one dialect might sound like a curse in another. And once offense was given, even by accident, it could not always be undone. Beyond language, belief, faith traveled the road alongside goods. Buddhism moved west from India to China. Islam flowed eastward into Central Asia. Christianity, in small and quiet ways, threaded through Armenia and the Nestorian missionaries. Zoroastrians lit their fires in Persia. Taoists and Confucians shaped life in the East. And behind all of them were customs deeply rooted in the sacred. To enter a temple without removing shoes. To touch a religious symbol with an unclean hand. To question a god that was not your own. These things, though small in gesture, could ripple outward like thunder. There were places where travelers were expected to convert, if not in faith, then in behavior. And refusal, even polite, could breed suspicion. Or worse, hostility. To pass safely, one often had to wear many masks. To nod without fully understanding. To offer reverence to shrines whose meaning remained a mystery. Even gestures, so simple and human, could betray a traveler. The wrong hand used in greeting. A meal refused when it should have been accepted. Eye contact made where it was not welcome. A woman addressed too boldly. A sacred animal touched too casually. None of these were crimes. But on the Silk Road, where honor was high and patience thin, they could become sparks. And yet, those who learned to listen, who moved slowly, watched carefully, asked gently, often passed unharmed. Respected, even welcomed. Because while tension always lingered beneath the surface, so too did curiosity. And hospitality. And a quiet recognition that we are all, in some way, travelers. But only those who treated belief, custom, and silence with respect survived the full length of the road. On the Silk Road, not every danger announced itself with swords or shouts. Some waited in silence, beneath the eyes of local rulers, behind the smiles of hosts, within the walls of cities where laws were not written for outsiders to understand. A single mistake could turn a traveler into a threat. To enter a sacred site without permission. To speak ill of a local leader while thinking no one listened. To forget the gift that custom required when meeting a governor or elder. These were not just oversights. They were seen as insult, as defiance, as disrespect. And disrespect had consequences. In some cities, it meant being watched. Traders found their goods delayed, their permits withheld. Lodgings suddenly became unavailable. Guards passed too often. Deals dissolved without explanation. It was not prison, it was isolation. A quiet exile, still within the city walls, but cut off from its rhythm. In more severe cases, exile became real. A traveler might be escorted to the edge of town, told they were no longer welcome. No map, no escort, no clear direction. Just the endless road and a reputation that would follow them to the next outpost. But the Silk Road also passed through kingdoms less forgiving. There were places where insult was punishable by lash or blade. A misstep in ritual, a wrongly interpreted gesture, a refusal to kneel or bow. Some rulers held honor above all things. Their courts were quiet, their punishments swift. And justice was not universal. A local could speak freely where a foreigner could not. A noble's servant might be protected, while a merchant with coin and knowledge had no recourse. In some towns, the mere suspicion of espionage, carrying letters, asking too many questions, could lead to arrest. Others found themselves in debt without realizing it. A meal offered freely was later considered a loan. A guide service came with unexpected fees. Disputes over contracts were resolved not in courtrooms, but in silence, with the accused quietly removed and their goods absorbed by the state. There were travelers who vanished, not in storms, not by bandits, but in the heart of cities, names removed from guest lists, tents left abandoned. No grave, no goodbye, just the absence. And so, many who survived the Silk Road did so by speaking little, offering much, and remembering that every culture is a house. To be welcomed in is a gift, but to offend the host even without intent is to be shown the door, or worse, never to find it again. The Silk Road taught its lessons gently at first, but for those who didn't listen, it taught them only once. The Silk Road was more than a passage through space. It was a passage through people. To walk it was to pass through empires and ideologies, each older than memory. And each one spoke a different language, not just in words, but in gestures, rituals, and the thousand small choices that revealed who you were. In Persia, travelers were greeted with a grace that ran deeper than hospitality. The air was rich with scent, saffron, rosewater, and sun-warmed earth. Guests were offered tea in tall glasses, the steam rising in spirals like incense. But beneath the generosity was structure. Elders were greeted first. Shoes were left at the door. Words were chosen carefully, for the Persians prized poetry even in ordinary speech. To interrupt, to boast, to speak without invitation, these were not just impolite. They were remembered. Further along the path, the steppes of Central Asia stretched wide and windswept. Here, among nomadic tribes, life moved with the seasons. Camps were built in circles, and strangers were welcomed with fermented mare's milk and roasted meat, even if they were watched closely. The customs here were shaped by mobility. To stay too long in one place was strange. Time itself moved differently. A traveler who lingered without purpose, or failed to show proper respect to clan leaders, could be turned away without explanation. Then came India, a land of color and contrast, of sacred rivers and tangled alleyways where incense hung thick in the air. Spirituality was not confined to temples. It lived in gestures, offerings, posture. Cows roamed freely. Monks moved barefoot. Festivals broke the silence of night with drums and laughter. But here, too, there were rules beneath the beauty. Purity mattered. Touch mattered. To eat with the wrong hand, to turn your feet toward a holy man, to enter a temple without washing, even without meaning harm, you might offend in ways you did not yet understand. And far to the east, China waited, orderly, ancient, refined. Cities like Chang'an and Luoyang greeted travelers with grandeur, tall gates, tiled roofs, markets bursting with porcelain and jade. But beneath the surface was a deep structure. Harmony governed daily life. Hierarchies were not just social, they were sacred. A bow too shallow could close a door forever. A gift offered without both hands might not be accepted. To speak directly, as some Westerners did, could seem rude or dangerous. And so, the Silk Road required more than strong legs. It required sensitivity, observation, humility. It was a world where one could not simply walk. One had to listen, not just to words, but to the silences between them, not just to customs, but to how people carried themselves in a room. Those who did not learn were often left behind. But those who watched, who adjusted, who greeted each new culture not with fear but with curiosity, those travelers moved forward. Quietly, safely, welcomed in places that had once seemed unreachable. Because the road did not only connect places, it connected people. And each connection was a test. One not of strength, but of understanding. No one walked the Silk Road alone. Alongside every traveler, every merchant, every pilgrim, walked another kind of soul. Silent, steady, enduring. The animals, camels most of all, were the lifeblood of the desert routes. Not the short-tempered, lazy beasts they are sometimes imagined to be, but patient survivors, perfectly suited to the harshness of the land. Their padded feet pressed softly into the sand. Their eyes, half shielded by long lashes, bore the sun without complaint. They could go for days without water, months carrying burdens not meant for flesh and bone. And yet they suffered. Their backs ached under the weight of spice, silk, ceramics, and grain. Their mouths were sometimes bound with rope. Their legs, wrapped in leather to protect from stones, still bled when the road turned cruel. They walked in the heat, in the cold, in sandstorms that blinded. And they never refused. They simply kept going, one foot, then the next, as if they understood there was no other path. Horses too had their place, swift, proud, loyal. They were the messengers, the scouts, the guardians of the high plains. They ran with wind in their manes, but they were not made for deserts. They faltered where camels thrived. Still, they were treasured for their strength, their speed, their spirit. A trader with a fine horse might sleep with one eye open, not for fear of raiders, but for fear of losing his greatest companion. Mules, oxen, even donkeys shared the burden too. In mountain paths too narrow for wagons, these animals carried everything. They bore silence, hunger, and exhaustion the way others carried fear, quietly without drama. But they were not invincible. When food ran low, it was often the animals who ate last. When water was scarce, their ration was poured only after the people drank. Some grew too thin to continue. Their legs swelled. Their eyes dulled. A stumble on a rocky ledge could mean a broken leg and a hard decision. Because the Silk Road did not wait. And mercy was a luxury. When a camel died, it was mourned, not with words, but with a moment of stillness. Then, its load was divided. A blanket was removed. Its spot in the line, empty. And the caravan moved on, quieter than before. Those who walked the Silk Road understood something modern minds often forget, that their survival was not their own. It was shared with these patient companions who never asked for thanks. And though history rarely records their names, it was their footprints that marked the way. Their sweat that watered the sand. Their strength that turned the impossible into something just barely achievable. They were not beasts of burden. They were travelers too. At the heart of the Silk Road was trade. They moved like breath, in and out, quietly, constantly. From east to west and back again, a dance of barter and promise that connected empires, villages, oases, and palaces. It began with silk, thin as wind, strong as steel. In China, it was woven in guarded workshops, the method of its creation held as a state secret for centuries. Smooth, shimmering, impossibly light, it passed from hand to hand like magic. The bolt of it could buy a house. A few pieces could feed a family for a year. To those in Rome, it seemed not of this earth. They called it a luxury, but truly, it was a mystery. How could something so soft survive a journey so harsh? But silk was only the beginning. Spices followed, cinnamon, of cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, the scent of distant forests wrapped in cloth. Then came incense, carried from Arabia and India, trailing clouds of fragrance wherever it passed. There was jade and porcelain, paper and glass, wool, tea, and even coral brought up from the deepest waters. And beyond objects, ideas, scripts, technologies, remedies, religions. A new prayer whispered in the corner of a caravan. A way to dye cloth passed from one merchant to another. Recipes, stories, rumors. The Silk Road was a corridor not just of wealth, but of transformation. But where there is trade, there is deception. Markets along the Silk Road glittered with promise. But not every gemstone was real. Not every potion cured illness. Traders learned to speak in a dozen tongues, but also to lie in them. Some sold water passed as wine. Some filled spice sacks with sawdust. Others diluted oils, stained cloth, or covered blemishes with clever folds. A traveler could lose everything in a single bargain. Scales were tampered with. Contracts disappeared. A seller might greet you with warmth, but raise prices after a single glance at your rings or robe. Some caravans were robbed not on the road, but in the marketplace itself. And yet they returned, because trade was more than survival. It was hope, the dream of return, of profit, of change. The Silk Road promised that something could be gained, not only gold, but meaning. That from the hardships, something beautiful would arrive. A scroll of teachings, a necklace for a beloved, a pouch of saffron worth more than silver. Even those who lost everything often tried again, because on the Silk Road, every trade was also a story. One that began long before the deal and continued long after the goods had changed hands. And some stories were worth the risk. Not every danger on the Silk Road rode on horseback. Some stood behind market stalls, smiling. The merchant cities along the route, Samarkand, Kashgar, Merv, Aleppo, were filled with color and motion. Banners waved. Animals bleated. Bells clinked over shop doors. Every alley seemed to whisper a deal, and every square was alive with the promise of something rare. But beneath the music of commerce was a quieter game, one of illusion, persuasion, and, at times, quiet theft. Cheating was not always obvious. It didn't come with shouting or threats. It came with charm. A seller would praise your taste, offer tea, speak your language, just enough to win trust. Then, as the coin changed hands, so did the rules. A bolt of silk might be switched for one of lesser weave. A bag of pepper might be filled from the top with spice and from the bottom with sand. Weights were adjusted with hidden stones. Scales were tipped just slightly. It was not robbery. It was craft. The oldest trick was urgency. Only one left. Another buyer is waiting. Price rises at sunset. And in the rush to make a deal, travelers bought what they did not inspect. Sometimes what they bought didn't even exist. Forgery was common. Old coins were polished to look new. Stamps and seals were faked. Letters of passage were sold only to be rejected at the next checkpoint. Some vendors even created entire shops built around illusions, mirrors, hidden compartments, borrowed stock from others. And not all scams ended at the marketplace. There were guides who promised safe routes, then disappeared after the first camp. Guards who were paid for protection, only to vanish during a raid they helped plan. Hosts who served a generous meal, and then charged for every grain of rice. Even within caravans, partnerships dissolved in betrayal. A trusted companion might take more than his share and leave before dawn. And yet, no one stopped trading, because the risk was expected, a part of the price. The wise traveler carried not just coin, but caution. They learned to count by weight, to listen without answering, to test everything before buying. Over time, they developed an instinct, not for truth, but for danger hiding in a smile. And still, even the most careful could be fooled, because the Silk Road was not just a place of riches. It was a place of stories. And stories, like silk, are easy to dye and hard to unweave. A traveler on the Silk Road might spend years preparing for a single journey. Goods were gathered, routes were studied, guides were hired, bribes were arranged, and prayers were offered to gods both near and far. And with all this done, they would finally set out, carrying with them not just cargo, but a future. Everything depended on the road ahead. A single roll of silk, packed carefully and protected through sand and storm, could buy land or status if it reached the right market. A chest of saffron, a bundle of lapis, a few rare scrolls, they were more than goods. They were possibilities. A dowry, a retirement, the second chance. But fortune on the Silk Road was delicate, easily promised, easily undone. A spilled water skin in the desert, a fever in the mountains, a horse that stumbled on a narrow ledge. A single night storm could sweep away a wagon. A border could close. A city could fall to war. And suddenly, everything, months of risk, of hunger, of careful trade, could vanish. Even success was fragile. You might sell your goods at a high price, only to be robbed before leaving town. You might reach the end of your journey, only to find your buyer gone, your coin devalued, your contract disputed. There were no guarantees. Wealth gained on the Silk Road was real, but it was never safe. Some traders grew rich. Their names were remembered in ledgers. Their homes expanded, but many more returned with less than they had left with. And some did not return at all. Even those who did succeed often lived with caution. They knew that a single misstep, one illness, one storm, one betrayal, could turn gold to dust. And so, the wise ones did not walk the road with pride. They walked it with humility, because the Silk Road did not reward ambition alone. It demanded patience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance that fortune, no matter how carefully packed, was always one broken axle or dishonest handshake away from disappearing. The Silk Road was a thread stretched taut across a shifting world. And while it passed through deserts and mountains, markets and temples, it also passed through empires. And empires, as all travelers came to learn, were never still. One season, a kingdom welcomed traders with feasts and protection. The next, its gates were barred, its ruler overthrown, its soldiers hungry for tribute. A caravan that had passed safely 1 year might return to find new banners flying over familiar walls, a new language spoken at the border, a new toll demanded with cold eyes. Empires rose along the Silk Road like the mountains themselves, high and immovable, until one day they crumbled. China's Han Dynasty, Persia's Sassanids, the mighty Kushan kings, the caliphates of the Arab world, the Mongol Khans, all held pieces of the road. And each, in time, gave way to conflict. Sometimes it was war. Armies marched across trade routes, taking grain, animals, and men. Fortresses burned. Passes became battlegrounds. And travelers, no matter their wealth or origin, were nothing more than shadows moving through firelight, prey or prisoner, depending on the mood of the day. Other times it was taxation. Rulers, desperate for gold or seeking to impress their rivals, raised tariffs. A toll at one city's gate, another at the bridge, another at the market. And always the threat behind the tax: pay or be delayed. Pay or be seized. Pay or vanish. There were years when the road grew quiet, not because trade had ended, but because the risk had grown too great. Because no one knew who ruled the next province. Because rebels moved in the hills, bandits wore stolen uniforms, and justice answered to whoever held the nearest sword. In some places, alliances changed faster than the seasons. A local lord might betray an empire for a better offer. A governor might be overthrown by his own guards. And a merchant, unaware of the day's politics, might greet the wrong man with too much familiarity and be taken for a spy. And yet, the Silk Road continued, because behind every power struggle, there remained a deeper rhythm, the hunger for trade, for connection, for movement. Even as empires clashed and borders bled, people still found ways to pass. They whispered new names, carried new stamps, wore new colors. They adapted. The smart ones knew loyalty was not to kings, but to the road itself. Because emperors fell, armies vanished, maps were redrawn again and again. But the Silk Road remained. It was not only the empires themselves that changed, but the very shape of the world they ruled. Borders on the Silk Road were never fixed. They moved like rivers after a flood, redirected by war, eroded by betrayal, swallowed by rebellion. A town once part of Persia might fly the banner of a Turkic prince the next year. A border post manned by Chinese soldiers might one day greet you in the name of a warlord who had never before ruled a mile of land. And in these shifts, safety disappeared. Travelers lived at the mercy of unseen decisions. One king's death in a distant capital could mean the collapse of order across 1,000 miles. A lost battle in the mountains might leave the valley below lawless for years. Governors appointed by distant courts were overthrown by their own commanders. Local lords grew ambitious. And mercenaries, once hired for protection, sometimes kept the land they were meant to defend. These men, the rogue warlords, became a power of their own. They taxed without permission. They took bribes to allow passage. They fought among themselves, and it was often traders who paid the price. If two factions disputed a pass, caravans were caught in the middle. If a local chief wanted to prove his strength, a foreign merchant might become the example. And there was no appealing to fairness. There was no law that ruled them all. What mattered was presence, who stood before you, and how many men stood behind him. Some traders adapted. They hired local guides with the right family name. They carried letters of safe passage signed by the current ruler, knowing it might be worthless a month later. Some gave gifts ahead of time, whispering greetings in a warlord's language, pretending friendship they did not feel. Others were not so lucky. Their goods were seized, their animals taken. Their companions vanished behind closed doors. Even if spared, they were often turned back, forced to walk hundreds of miles in the opposite direction, poorer, weaker, and unsure of what land they'd be entering next. And so, travelers on the Silk Road learned not just geography, but temperament. They listened closely in the marketplaces, asked careful questions at the inns. They watched the guards at the gate, how they stood, what they wore, whose symbols they bore. Because survival did not come from knowing where you were. It came from knowing who held power, and how quickly that power might disappear. To the outsider, there may have been the illusion that the Silk Road was peaceful, a long ribbon of trade, a corridor between civilizations. And at times it was. But peace, along the Silk Road, was not the absence of war. It was the pause between uncertainties, a quiet moment between two storms. Even in times when no battles raged, tension remained. Merchants still paid bribes at checkpoints. Guards still watched strangers too long. Borders remained fragile, drawn not with ink but with fear. Armies were only ever a few weeks away. A single rumor of rebellion, of assassination, of famine in a nearby province could ripple through the markets like a cold wind. People pretended life was normal. Markets opened. Camels were loaded. Bells chimed at the city gates. But there was always a calculation behind every smile. Should I leave this week or next? Is the road ahead truly safe, or just quiet? Will the pass still be open by the time I return? Because in truth, the Silk Road was stitched together by chance. A trader might pass through the same village 3 times and be welcomed each time, only to arrive once more and find it burned. A prince who once offered safe passage might be overthrown before the snow melts from the mountain trails. A trusted partner might be taken by plague or imprisoned by a new ruler with a short temper. And through it all, survival was never promised. You could do everything right. Choose the right season. Hire the right guards. carry the right letters, and still lose everything. A storm, a betrayal, a border closed without warning, a war begun in a city you'd never heard of. There were no guarantees, only movement and faith. Not religious faith, but the quiet belief that going forward still mattered, that there was something worth reaching for. And so, the travelers continued, not because peace reigned, but because they had already placed too much of their life into motion to stop. And because, for many, the silence of the road, even laced with risk, was more bearable than the silence of failure. The Silk Road did not end with a gate or a border. It simply faded, from trail to town, from desert to sea, until the caravans gave way to ships, and the long, slow march of hoof and foot was replaced by sails and smoke. But for those who walked it, the road never truly ended. It remained inside them, in the calluses on their hands, in the lines beneath their eyes, in the memories they no longer spoke of. And in time, those travelers grew old. Or they vanished. Or they stopped walking and simply stayed, building homes in strange cities, raising children in unfamiliar languages, growing gardens on land that once seemed only a place to pass through. For some, the journey brought wealth. They returned to their villages wrapped in foreign cloth, their tables filled with spices and rare wine. Their stories became legend, their names spoken with respect. But even then, there was something in their gaze. A quiet heaviness, a knowing, because the Silk Road gave much, but it asked for much more. Others returned with nothing, no coin, no goods, just the breath still in their lungs and stories too painful to tell. They lived simply, watching the horizon like an old friend they no longer dared to chase. And many never returned at all. Some lie beneath cairns of stone, marked only by a circle of bleached bone. Others were buried by sandstorms, or by time, or by the forgetting that follows every generation. But they were there. They walked through cities that no longer stand. They drank from wells long since dry. They whispered songs in languages no one speaks now. And in doing so, they left something behind, not in books or monuments, but in the shape of the world itself. Because the Silk Road was not just a route for trade. It was a breath passed from east to west, a bridge of dust and hope, a path where every step carried a story, and every story became a thread in the great weaving of history. And perhaps that is the legacy, not the silk or the gold, not the ruined empires or vanished kings, but the simple truth that people kept moving, despite the hunger, despite the heat, despite the unknown. They kept moving toward one another. And so now, as you rest, far from the deserts, far from the wind, know that you, too, carry that same human thread. The longing to reach, the willingness to risk, the quiet hope that something waits just beyond the edge of the map. And now, as our journey draws to its close, we pause. Not in haste, not with triumph, but with stillness. We have traveled far, not just in distance, but in memory. Through sunlit markets and shadowed passes, across cold mountains and burning sands. We have walked beside camels and monks, merchants and warlords, pilgrims and ghosts. And in doing so, we have seen the Silk Road not as a line between places, but as a living thing, fragile, breathing, and full of quiet wisdom. We have learned that survival was not about strength. It was about rhythm, the rhythm of footsteps in silence, the rhythm of sharing food in a tent at night, the rhythm of bowing in unfamiliar temples, of learning to ask questions before speaking, of sleeping with one eye open and one hand near the pouch that held your future. We have seen how the road gave, and how quickly it could take. It gave connection, beauty, knowledge. And it took without warning, through disease, betrayal, hunger, and wind. We felt the cold grip of frostbite and the slow ache of an empty stomach. We've watched trust falter in marketplaces where smiles didn't always mean safety. We've witnessed how easily borders dissolve, how empires fall, How one quiet misstep in a land of unfamiliar customs could end a journey before it truly began. But through it all, people continued. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Silk Road. Not its wealth, not its scale, not even its influence, but its humanity. It was walked by people who feared, who hoped, who doubted, who loved, just like us. People who risked everything not for glory, but for survival, for family, for a dream, and who carried their stories across thousands of miles, never knowing if they'd be heard. They taught us that greatness doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it's found in persistence, in the quiet folding of a tent before sunrise, in the offering of half a meal to a stranger, in the ability to keep walking one more day. And now you too have walked it, not with your feet, but with your mind. You felt the dust settle on your skin, heard the clang of distant coins, smelled the smoke from cooking fires outside forgotten towns. And though this journey ends here, its memory will remain, like the faint imprint of footsteps on ancient stone. So let this be your final thought before sleep takes you. The world is wide. The road is long. But every step, even the hardest ones, brings us closer to one another. Thank you for joining into PlotFall for tonight's story. Until next time, good night.